My name's Nickole, and I'm calling because I'm concerned about a friend of mine. She's 15 weeks pregnant, and she wasn't feeling well over the weekend, and I have called and texted. I've come to her house. She's not answering the door. She's not responding to text messages, phone calls. I've had other friends reach out to her. None of us can get her to respond to us, and her car is here.
What's her name?
Shan'ann Watt.
And her husband's name is?
His name is Chris Watt. I just want to know if she's okay.
Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Atkinson Transcripts on the Patreon channel of True Crime Rocket Science. The third part covers 5 pages detailing Nickole's calls to Watts, Sandy and the cops, as well as Watts' arrival at the scene. What I find interesting in this particular section is the way that Nickole describes Watts' arrival compared to what we see on Coonrod's body cam. And what I want to emphasize here I'm not trying to undermine what Nickole Atkinson said, but just to show how when somebody describes something in kind of a offhand way, just a member of the public, how easy it is to get a version that can be I don't want to say unreliable or inaccurate, but that it can put the law enforcement kind of on the wrong track, or just how easy it is to put law enforcement on the wrong track by stating things in kind of an ambiguous way. And that's something we're going to investigate in this particular episode. Once again, I just want to thank all the patrons on Patreon. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Some of you may be wondering why there's sort of 2 channels, the YouTube channel that's free and the Patreon channel that's not. The YouTube channel is still going on because people contributed about $400 onto GoFundMe, and so I've continued the YouTube channel for another month, but I plan on from 2020 onwards just sort of doing mostly videos on Patreon with the occasional video on YouTube. So I don't want to be giving away free content on YouTube the way that I am now in the new year. And so without any further ado, let's go into the Atkinson Transcripts, number 3 of 15. Bear in mind, all of this is available on Crime Rocket if you want to read the rest on your own, at your own pace and at your own convenience. We resume the narrative now on page 24 of the 72-page transcript. And we're at the point where Nickole Atkinson is sort of relating to Zentner that she'd been to the doctor's office, that the doctor told her that Shan'ann wasn't there, didn't make an appearance, and then she realized something is seriously wrong because she'd also been in contact with Cassie and Christina all morning, and they were, besides Nickole, there were other people who would normally talk to Shan'ann every day. And Nickole said that when she called them, she said, what do I do? Chris said she's with a friend, and these are Nickole's words, and they were like, go back to the house and call the cops. So then I drove back to the house and I called Chris again. I said, I'm going back. Well, I texted Shan'ann again, and then she apologized to Zentner for sort of jumping around. Now, what's quite important to emphasize here, and again, I'm not criticizing Nickole or anybody else. I'm simply pointing out that Nickole had the assistance of two other people in deciding how she was going to respond to the events of that day. So it was actually a cooperative effort. It was like a team effort. It was like a team Shan'ann that was sort of activating. And specifically Cassie and Christine, and both of these women were very well aware of what Shan'ann was going through because they'd encountered Shan'ann themselves in Arizona, right? Christina also knew Shan'ann very well from living with her, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, in the previous episode, we covered that Nickole said that she'd called Watts at 12:27, but then she says at 12:47, so 20 minutes later, she texted Shan'ann again, and she said, this was the text message: "I've been to your house. You won't open the door. Your alarm's set. Your shoes are sitting inside. Your car's home. I'm very concerned about you right now. I need you to text me or call. I just want to know you're okay. If you don't want to talk to nobody, you don't want to be around anybody, I get it. It's fine. I just need to know you're okay." And she didn't respond. Now, what I think is quite fascinating with that particular message is that Nickole herself is sort of intuiting that Shan'ann may be upset and just wants to be left alone. Now, can you imagine if Chris Watts had her handset and had just responded something like, "Please leave me alone," on Shanann's phone? He could have diffused the whole situation, obviously nefariously. They have used that word again. But you know what I'm getting at, that the psychology was there that Shan'ann may have been understandably upset given the circumstances of the day, but because there was no use of the phone, it didn't make any sense. And this is definitely the aspect where I think Chris Watts may have had a plan, but the plan didn't go according to plan. In other words, he may have wanted to use Shanann's phone. Bear in mind that Shanann's always on Facebook, so you don't have to see her to know that she's out there doing something. And he could have used her phone from home, and said certain things, and created a afterlife for her, a fictional afterlife. And who would have known better how to do that than him, because he'd participated in so many of the Thrive things. He'd been referenced in so many of her comments on social media. So Nickole sort of emphasizes that Cassie also called Chris, and Cassie also told Chris that he needed to go to his house. And that's quite interesting as well, is Nickole didn't really say to Chris, "Come home." It was more that Cassie kind of laid down the law. And then Zenta asks, a little bit about Christina, and Nickole describes her as somebody who lived with Chris and Shan'ann for 6 weeks when Shan'ann had neck surgery. Cassie is from Arizona, and she'd been planning on moving to Colorado basically the next month, and they were going to move in with the Watts family. That's how close the Rosenbergs were with Shan'ann. And then Christina had actually lived with them. So all three of these friends know the Watts family sort of inside out, especially Shan'ann. And then moving on to page 25, there's some sort of confusion about time, where Nickole says that she called Chris at 12:41, and then there's some uncertainty. I don't know why Zenta doesn't just say, "Well, let me see your phone and confirm it," but there's a bit of confusion here. But the bottom line is that Nickole was calling her friends, she was reaching out to other people, and she was also calling Chris, and she was calling Shan'ann. And the bottom line is that Chris was sort of almost playing a game where he was not really available, he was not really returning home, even though people thought that he was. He was sort of, I won't say playing a game, but he was sort of taking his time getting back. And did he really want to see Nickole when he got back? No, he didn't. And so maybe he thought if he took long enough to get back, maybe things would sort of sort themselves out. And so Nickole sort of describes how, based on what he'd said to her, she expected him to be back much earlier than he was. And because he was taking longer than he said, and this was an early indication of deception and, misleading people. She then contacted the police, and also what's sort of interesting here is that she said that she called the police department at 1:31, and that's not a bad guess, but in fact she called the Weld County, Colorado 911 dispatch on Monday morning at 1:35, as is depicted in the Criminal Confessions documentary on Oxygen. Now we can actually compare Nickole's concern to the concern of Shane Carey, who waited all afternoon to call the police in that respect. He was aware of his fiancée not being around at about 2 o'clock, according to him, and then around about 5.5 hours went by before he called the police. Now in Nickole's case, she was, I guess, well aware of the situation when she went to the doctor, and Nickole basically contacted the police in about half the time that Shane Carey did. So we're arguing for about 3 hours. One could theoretically argue that she was aware that Shan'ann wasn't around when she texted her, I think just before 9 o'clock, right? So if you're going to take that time into account, then you're heading for about 4.5 hours in total. So in that respect, you could sort of argue that Shane Carey taking as long as he did isn't necessarily a red flag. But one has got to also compare his phone records and how much he was texting friends to Nickole. Was he texting friends of Heidi as much as Nickole was texting Cassie, Christina, and Chris? So for whatever reason, Chris Watts took quite a long time to come back. We don't know whether he was delayed for any kind of good reason at his work. We don't know what took him so long to kind of leave. Maybe he had to get permission to leave. Maybe he had to explain to his people, his colleagues, kind of what was going on. Maybe he had, things that he really had to get done at the well site. Maybe that was an aspect. We do know that he spent a small amount of time diverting away to Black Mesa Road, where he disposed of probably clothing and perhaps the blankies. But that wouldn't have taken more than 2, 3, 4 minutes. To clarify the 12:41 call, Nickole, I think, referenced her handset at this point, and then she said she had an incoming call at 12:41. She said it lasted for 42 seconds, and she said, I think it was Chris calling her to ask if Nickole was still at the house messing with the door. And we can see that from that time, from 12:41, it was just less than an hour later that Nickole called the police. So if you bear in mind that Watts had to have known about the situation at that stage, and he still wasn't back half an hour from then or an hour from then, well, it did make sense to call the police when Nickole did call the police. It's a bit sort of mind-bending to sort of go through what Cassie is saying about that Chris should have been there 30 minutes later, and then what Nickole says about him being there 45 minutes later, whatever. The best thing to do is go through the transcript, write down the times that the calls were made and the times that Chris Watts apparently said he was going to be back. But obviously in both Cassie's case and Nickole's case, Chris was telling them times that he wasn't sticking to. He was taking longer than he had he told both of them. And so that was what prompted both of them to feel that they were justified in calling the police. So I kind of get the impression Nickole called him for a third time at 1:52, just again saying, where are you? And in Coenraad's body cam, Nicholas Atkinson can actually be heard telling Coenraad that, what was supposed to have been there, whatever it was, half an hour earlier, and he'd been saying for the past length of time, that he would be there, in so many minutes, and he just wasn't. And this was already causing suspicion, not only amongst Nickole, but also amongst for her son. All of this is really neither here nor there. The part that I really want to emphasize is really the description Nickole gives of Chris Watts arriving at the house at 2825 Saratoga Trail. That's really the part that I want to focus on and emphasize in this particular episode, because we all know from watching the video what happened. And what I again want to just emphasize here is how an eyewitness can give information that is accurate but also kind of misleading unintentionally. And so we're going to go through this yellow text that I've highlighted here, and I just want you to think in the back of your mind what you remembered and what you saw in terms of that body cam footage. Bear in mind, this was just one very brief, very quick moment for Nickole, whereas many of us have watched it over and over and over again. So just bear in mind that that's an advantage we have, over this kind of scenario. Okay, so here we go. So this brings us to page 28, where Nickole is saying that Chris Watts says, well, I don't want to break down the door if he's not here. Sorry, that's what Coenraad must have said. I don't want to break down the door if he's not here. And so Nickole is describing Coenraad sort of, running around the house, knocking on windows, knocking on doors, hollering outside. He also knocked on the basement window. And she says she's also trying to figure out how he could get in. And then she said, well, Chris was 10 or minutes away or whatever it was. And then she said it was a very short conversation, I think with Chris Watts, where she said she spoke to him for 17 seconds. And then this is what this then brings us to the description of Chris Watts arriving. And so this is what Nickole says. So then Chris gets there, and the police officer was like, do you know where your wife is? And he's like, no. He's like, well, can you open your door so we can go inside? And he wasn't there yet. And then I called her mom, because I thought, because her mom had lived there too, meaning Sandy. And then I called Cassie, because Cassie stayed with her, and then her mom stayed with her. So I was trying to get anybody to give us a code for the garage, because that was the only way to get in. So I let Chris go, and then I called her mom, and her mom didn't know what was going on. And I was like, Sandy, do you have a code to Shan'ann and Chris's garage door? And she was like, and she started giving me numbers, but none of them worked. And then I, of course, had to tell her what was going on. And I didn't call her before that because I didn't want to upset her if there was nothing to upset her about. And so, and then Chris showed up and let us in. So there's so much going on in that description. Nickole is sort of jumping from Chris arriving to calling Sandy, and then kind of explaining the whole scenario with the code, but also explaining that she didn't really want to call Sandy because she didn't want to upset her. And I think that is such a vital insight. There is Sandy also is a temperamental person and an emotional person, and Nickole felt more comfortable just talking to her friends about the situation, and she kind of didn't want to speak to Sandy at that point. She literally says, I didn't want to upset her if there was nothing to upset her about. And of course, once she did call Sandy Sandy stayed on the line for quite a long time. She was on speaker for a very long time. If you go strictly by this description from Nickole, there's sort of nothing here about him arriving, speaking very briefly, going into the garage, looking in Shan'ann's car, and then entering the house alone and then letting them in. I'm just talking about specifically this description, which is about when Chris arrived. Nickole's not focused on what Chris was doing. She's kind of more focused on what she was doing. She's focused on calling Sandy, getting the code, all this kind of stuff. And then it's Zentner who basically says, well, how did he let you in? And then Nickole says, he opened the garage door. And then Nickole sort of adds, it didn't dawn on me. It didn't dawn on me to go in through the garage door, something like that. And that then brings us to the next page where, and this is sort of the end of this particular episode, but it's where Zentner says, well, is there a door through to the garage? And Nickole says yes. Now, obviously it's a bit misleading just to end off on this particular point, but if you just think of it in a kind of a logical way, when Zentner says, how did he let you in? Chris Watts didn't let anyone in through the garage door, certainly not initially. How everyone got access to the scene in the beginning was through the front door, and there was that delay. And so that's a critical thing that may not have occurred to her and may not have been very important to her, but you can see how information can be lost through details like that. Because bear in mind, there was another point where the garage door was open, and they were probably there's another scene where Detective Baumhover walks into the house behind Chris Watts through the garage door, not through the front door. And so do you see how you can have errors creeping into an account? Not where someone's trying to be misleading, but simply where they are a little bit losing track of the chronology of how things actually played out. And in criminal cases, these kinds of discrepancies that can creep in just by ordinary human error can be used to invalidate a witness. You can use these errors and say, well, you know what, that's not actually what happened, and this witness is unreliable. And so that's just something that I think is worth highlighting, just as an aspect of true crime that is certainly interesting. In the fourth episode in this series, we'll deal with Nickole's concerns and suspicions when Watts arrives and immediately ducks into the garage. So that is raised in the fourth part. And then we'll also focus on Watts' strange entry into the house. Thank you for listening to this episode. Look out for the next episode in this series next week, Wednesday. I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break from regular updates. I'm going to also be taking a little bit of a break from the Watts case by focusing on John Benet Ramsey, a little bit of content on that as we head towards Christmas. I may also be doing a bit more content on the Shane Carey case, depending on what the developments are. And I will probably still do another episode on criminal confessions, just because I haven't finished that analysis. But for the last couple of days of this month, I'll probably allow the sort of pace of the videos to drop a little bit, just going into Christmas and towards the new year. There won't be a complete absence of content, but there will just be a little bit less than maybe you guys are used to. Hope that's okay. I'll probably see you guys on Monday for another episode on Ask the Expert. If you've got any suggestions for that, let me know. And we'll eventually get round to the narcissism series on this channel, but probably we'll be getting around to that probably in the new year. And I'll see you guys. I'll see you guys next time.